Welcome, investigator. Evil is on the rise. Crime is escalating. Our mission is to eliminate the crime by exposing evil, examine why it manifests, and highlight the brave souls that confront it every day. Join us as we work together to bring justice to every victim. Welcome to All Things Crime. Here's your host, Jared Bradley.
Hey, everybody. Episode 4 of my discussion with Detective Lindsey Wade from the Tacoma Police Department.
We also knew that based on the level of violence, the predatory nature of the murders, it was likely that this was not a one and done, that the offender, like in Jennifer's case, this probably wasn't his first or his last victim. So I felt really strongly that he was somewhere identified as being a sexual deviant that, and for whatever reason had slipped through the cracks. I would later come to find out that I was completely wrong, and that, as it turned out, this guy had pretty much no criminal history. So fast forward to 2016, that was the 30-year anniversary of the murders. And so I decided that I was running our child abduction response team for the police department at the time, and we were required to conduct an exercise each year, like a mock exercise. And so I decided that year we were going to do something different. We were going to basically take these cold cases and push them out to the media as if they were brand new cases, and open up a tip line and exercise our team, but do it in a way that we were actually going to be working on a real case as opposed to, some fictitious or mock exercise. So we had about 60 participants over a 2-day period. We opened a tip line, and we did a big press conference and released the new DNA information that we had, that we were looking at 2 separate offenders. We had worked with Parabon Nanolabs and had the DNA sketches generated based on the SNP testing that was done for the 2 offenders. And we had one group of detectives that were assigned to follow up on new tips that came into the tip line. And then we had another group of detectives that were assigned to go out and collect DNA samples from people who were in the case file, who I had deemed as high priority suspects. And for maybe 3 months leading up to this exercise, I had gone through the entire case file, which was massive for both cases. And I had pulled out every single male name out of the file, because you got to remember, these crimes occurred in '86. So they're all handwritten and typed reports. Nothing was computerized. So I used the database that we used for our child abduction response team to organize the file. I added every single male name that appeared in the case file to this database, and included what report they were listed in, why they were there, what their criminal history was, if their DNA was collected or not, and if they were deceased or living, and if we knew where they were. And then I prioritized them based on their criminal history. So when I got done doing that, I had over 2,300 male names between the 2 cases that were in my database. And so from there, it was like, okay, we'll take some of them, like the top people, and focus on getting DNA collected from them during the exercise and then in the days following. And then we'll also, look at the new tips that come in as a result of this exercise. So we got about 120 new tips that came in during the exercise, and I think we collected about 20 or so samples during the exercise. Afterwards, I reached out to the U.S. Marshals and asked them if they could assist us in collecting DNA. Unfortunately, they couldn't, because they can only really assist with registered sex offenders, but they did give us some funding to continue collecting DNA from these offenders, basically on an overtime basis for our detectives. So we spent the next few months going out, pounding the pavement, knocking on doors, and making contact with guys that were listed in the case file for one reason or another, and asked them for voluntary samples of their DNA, which most provided. I think we had a handful of people that refused. But we basically focused on the people that I had kind of deemed high priority. And high priority in my mind were people that had criminal history that, included murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, or people that were just hinky and acting bizarre in the area where the crimes occurred. So that's what we focused on. And we ended up collecting 161 DNA samples from this little project. I need to back up a little bit because one of the people that I included in that list was not really a high priority suspect, but I included him for a different reason. And are you still there, by the way?
Oh, yeah. Boy,
Okay.
I'm just mesmerized by this conversation. It's like, holy cow. I mean, I honestly hope that everybody that's listening to this is just like, wow. Because, and definitely don't lose your place because we want to go back to it. But there's a couple of things that came to my mind as you were talking. And number one is there are homicides that are just kind of run of the mill, especially that's kind of like what Cloyd calls them, where you actually catch the guy at the scene or somebody, it's pretty obvious that it's like the ex-husband killed the ex-wife and lots of witnesses and or somebody even admits to it, they'll confess to the crime. Those are kind of the run of the mill homicides.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what percent of the common, the homicides that you've seen are like that versus the ones you're describing. But the one that we're talking about, this case of, Jennifer being killed, where it kind of goes into the cold case mode, people need to understand the massive amount of resources and effort that it takes to solve these crimes.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, a lot of those are also the more high profile type of crimes that
Right.
where people are like, well, the Tacoma PD is incompetent because they can't solve this particular crime. Well, which is just ridiculous because you guys are solving 90% of the other crimes because they're kind of more run of the mill. But there are some of these more intricate, I don't know if that's the right word, but cases that you really don't have any really good leads.
Right.
And yeah, what you're describing is just mesmerizing. I'm like, the amount of effort that it takes, and especially when you're dealing with a cold case that's 30 years old,
Mm-hmm.
the evidence has been degraded, a lot of it, and especially once you get into like the West Coast, or I'm sorry, the East Coast, and where you get humidity, you start getting mold, you start getting all sorts of issues, sometimes stuff just in the process of 30 years. I think about out of all the homes that I've lived in and moved multiple times, if there's a particular shirt or something that I'm looking for, I can't find that stuff. It's like, who knows where it is? But
right.
I know the logging process for evidence is a lot better than that, but than my 30-year-old wardrobe. But the key is people need to understand how much effort detectives like you go through. And once you get into a cold case like this, where you really don't have any good suspects, how much effort it actually takes. And that's why I'm so grateful that you're sharing this, because I think it's such a learning process that society as a whole needs to understand that solving some of these cases really isn't it. And this is the whole CSI thing.
Mm-hmm.
When you are sitting on the stand and you're trying to explain everything that you did to solve this case, I'm sure the jury is just sitting there with their mouths open, like, are you kidding me?
Right.
So yeah, awesome, man. Awesome stuff. So, okay. So let's go back to where you were.
Okay. So I'm going to backtrack to 2015. So I got out of order there, but in 2015, Gene Miller was the original cold case detective for our agency, and he retired at the end of 2014. So 2015, I really took over full time doing cold cases. And that at the beginning of the year, I had heard about these two cases in Phoenix that had been solved. They were cold cases from 1990 or 91, and they had been solved with the help of this genealogist who had provided the agency with a potential last name of the suspect. And it was just like happenstance because the detectives were in Tacoma. They were at our station doing some follow-up on the case. And so they got to, telling me about how they developed a suspect. And I was just floored. I'm like, okay, she did what? Okay, she gave you a last name of the suspect based on his DNA. So, and this is the first time I'd ever heard anything like this. This is well before Golden State, all of this. This is 2015. And so I was like, I need this woman's name immediately. So I get a hold of her. Her name's Colleen Fitzpatrick. I don't know if you've interviewed her on your show or not, but Colleen is the founder of Identifinders International. She is a rocket scientist turned genealogist, and she is known to be, definitely one of the founders of the field of forensic genealogy. So I reach out to Colleen and I tell her about my cases, and I'm like, I've got DNA left. So can you help me? Because I understand what you did with the cases in Phoenix. Can you do that with my cases? And so she says, yeah, I can. So, you just need to have your crime lab generate Y-STR profiles if you've got DNA left, which thankfully I did have DNA extract left in both my cases. So I had our state crime lab generate Y-STR profiles for my suspect in both cases. And then I sent the profiles to her. And she used, the databases that she has access to. And, coming from the genealogy world, this is how people track their family tree, right? Is through like the male surnames. So she was able to produce reports for me that showed several potential surnames for my suspect based on the family tree. And so, as you know, the Y-STR, the Y DNA is the DNA that's passed down from father to son. So it should theoretically stay the same along the paternal line. And so that DNA profile, the father, son, grandfather on the same paternal line should all, in theory, share the same last name. So she gives me the report back on Jennifer's case, and there were 3 potential surnames: Smith, Holbrook, and Washburn. And of course, with Smith, I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Like, what am I going to do with Smith? That's going to be, there was nobody named Smith in my case file that really stood out. I had no Holbrooks, but I had one Washburn. And so I look up the Washburn that I have, and I see that he had called in a tip on the other case that had occurred 4.5 months before Jennifer's case. So that's the reason he was in the case file. So I, run his name. I don't find anything about him that stands out. No significant criminal history. I think he had 1 or 2 misdemeanor arrests the year before. So there was just, nothing jumped out. But because of the fact that he had the last name Washburn, I decided to include him on my list of high priority offenders to get DNA from. As we're moving forward and collecting all these DNA samples from these guys in the case file, there were about 40 that we got, that we had the FBI collect from people who were living out of state. And this is, another thing to keep in mind with cold cases is these people scatter to the 4 winds. So, a lot of the people that are listed in the case are either dead or they've moved to some other area and they don't live here anymore. So luckily, I had a great partnership with the FBI, and I had an FBI agent named Terry Postma who was working with me full time on these cases. And so he assigned leads out to all these different field offices around the country and had agents go out and knock on doors and collect DNA samples from these people. And again, these are all voluntary samples. So, these are not with court orders or anything like that. It's just, hey, we're investigating a cold case. Your name came up. We're trying to eliminate you. Would you give us a sample of your DNA? Yes or no? So Washburn, as it turned out, was living in Illinois. And so he was one of the 40 or 41 samples that the FBI collected for me during the process. So once I had all these samples collected and we had kind of run out of overtime money from the marshals, I started cataloging the samples that were collected and submitting them to the crime lab in batches. And of course, this is going to overwhelm the crime lab, right? To be sending in hundreds of DNA reference samples on a cold case that's 30 some years old. So the crime lab requested that I send in batches of 20, which I did. And I actually used some of the Marshall funding to actually test the first 100 at Sorensen using their paternity lab. So they were able to put them all on like one chip and do it all at once. But the rest I had to submit to the crime lab. And of course, the first 100 I send into Sorensen, they don't match, either of the cases. And so they're all eliminated. And then I start sending in my batches of 20. And, first batch goes out, and 4 to 6 months later, I get a report from the lab saying none of these are a match. And then I send the next batch out, and, same scenario. The last batch, I had 18 samples left, and I sent it out in January of 2018. And by that point, I had looked at everybody that had already been tested, and the ones that I was really excited about, the guys that I thought were like real creeps, they all got eliminated. And so I really, in the last 18, there was nobody in there that I had any hope of getting a match for. And I just, I sent them out and really didn't think much of it. I just thought, okay, they'll be eliminated. And then, I don't really know what to do with this case after this. During that same time frame, I ended up getting recruited to go work for the Attorney General's office on the sexual assault kit initiative. And they had gotten the grant from Department of Justice to work on the statewide backlog. And I figured, well, I think I'm ready for a change. I had been with the police department for 21 years at that point and was ready to do something different. And so I ended up taking the job with the AG's office to be an investigator and to, hope in my mind, I thought, well, who knows, maybe one of these sexual assault kits, because we had about, and I think there was an estimated 10,000 kit backlog in Washington state. And so I was thinking, well, maybe one of these kits will be the answer, to solving these cases. But at that point, I retired from police work. April 13th, I believe, was my last day as a Tacoma police officer. And I went to work for the AG's office, and I think it was 25 days later, I get a phone call from the detective who replaced me in the cold case unit, asking me if I'm sitting down. And, that's never a good thing when someone calls you and asks you if you're sitting down. And so then he goes on to tell me, we have a match on the Jennifer Bastian case. And so I'm like, no freaking way. What? Like, who is it?
In this case, that's a good thing.
Yeah. Like, who's the match to? And he tells me Robert Washburn. And I just about lost it. I'm like, no way. Robert Washburn. So, I end up jumping in the car and going down to the station. And it was, I can't even really describe the surrealness of the whole thing, because it was like one of those cases where, even though there were so many people over so many years just spinning their wheels, trying to solve it, I don't know that we ever really truly believed it was going to happen. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's so many dead ends, so many, really good suspects that were eliminated. And it was just like, this guy's a phantom. He's a ghost. Like, does he even exist? Well, it turned out he did exist, and his name was Robert Washburn. So Washburn was contacted by the FBI. He was one of the people that had given a voluntary sample during the DNA collection project. Of course, he had been collected now well over a year and a half earlier. And so I'm thinking, geez, like, is this guy even still around? Like, is he still alive? I mean, what did he do after he gave his DNA? So immediately, law enforcement in Illinois conducted surveillance and got eyes on him, and knew where he was at. And then a team of detectives from Tacoma flew out to Illinois. So this was May 8th, 2018, when the DNA match came in, and they arrested him on the 10th. And then that same morning, as soon as they notified us that he was in custody, I was tasked with going to Pattie Bastian's home and telling her that her daughter's killer was finally identified after 32 years.
Wow. What was that like?
Well, first, as soon as I got the news of the DNA match on the 8th, I was sworn to secrecy. We did not want it getting out. And so I couldn't talk to anybody about it. And so I'm carrying this around. And of course, all kinds of emotions, are going through my head, like, Jesus, why did I leave? Why did I wanted to be the one to put the handcuffs on this guy. What bad timing, and then just lots of different things. But also, I was terrified that I was going to have, I actually scheduled to have Mother's Day brunch with Pattie Bastian. I had invited her before all this happened to have brunch with my family on Mother's Day, which was that coming Sunday. And so I was terrified that I was going to have to sit across the table from her and holding this secret. And so I'm like, you guys have got to make this arrest before Mother's Day. I can't do it. Like, I literally cannot do it. So he was arrested. I got to go knock on her door, and it was pretty surreal because I had rehearsed, something, to say to her. And it really, I just completely forgot all of it. It went all out the window. As soon as she answered the door, she knew something was up. It was 7:00 in the morning. I woke her up, and, there's this really tall assistant chief in uniform standing next to me that she's never seen before. So she knows something's going on. And so, all I could really tell her was, we got him. There were lots of hugs and tears. And then we called her daughter, who lived out of state, and told her. And it was pretty amazing. It was very surreal. And while I was initially sad that I didn't get to put the handcuffs on this guy, I also recognized that it was more important for me to be the one to tell Pattie, to spend the rest of the day with her. So it was, without a doubt, the best day of my career.
What an amazing story. That in some ways, I think a lot of anybody that really understands what detectives and police in general go through, I think would be envious of that day, and thinking that that's kind of a common day, as opposed to the really crap days where you have to sit across from that same type of mom and explain, your loved one's gone or something like that. And, I hope that throughout your career that the good days would definitely outweigh and be, they're probably not as common, but would definitely outweigh and make up for all of the really bad days.
Yeah. Those are the moments that are, I hate to say it, but once in a career, but they make everything worth it. There were many, many days when I went into the office and looked around at that, looked at the case file and just thought, this is pointless. And I'm literally looking for a needle in a haystack. I don't even know how this is even possible. But there was something that was driving me to keep moving forward. And I credit Pattie Bastian a lot for that, because she was such a motivator for me. I absolutely respected her and loved her positivity and her willingness to, just offer support. She was, I don't even know. I would just look at her and think, I don't even know how you are the person that you are after surviving what you've been through. I think that a lot of people could, turn in a different direction and she was not that way at all. She was just absolutely fantastic, such a cheerleader. And for me, she was the motivator, because I would think to myself, you know what, like if she can get up every day and put a smile on her face and be, a positive influence on so many people, then you know what, I can do this. And so there were certainly days when her positivity and motivation helped kind of, push me to keep digging and moving forward.
Yeah. I know our video is not working right now, but I'm just sitting back here, just shaking my head thinking, because you've explained it so well. And the visual that I have is of you standing there with this, typical suburban mom and just going through this. And I have met enough of the, victim family types to kind of understand it. I've seen some court cases and things like that where, a murderer is convicted, and to see the reaction on the family's face, some of it's relief, some of it is sadness, the levels of emotions that these families go through. Number one, they have to cope with a loved one being gone.
Right.
But then to be in such an intimate relationship that you have with a detective like you has to add just, the faith and love and trust that she had to put in you, enough to motivate you to keep going. That's just phenomenal. And wow, what an awesome story. So
yeah, I mean, it was the relationship and the case and everything. I mean, it was a once in a lifetime for me. I will say that the thing that I didn't expect or didn't anticipate was how difficult it was going to be on the family to solve the case. I mean, in my mind, I'm like thinking from the law enforcement perspective, like, yay, we solved it. But, for the family, and this is really something to keep in mind for investigators, is, yeah, you solved it, but you just ripped off a scab on a festering wound that's been festering for 30 years. And it's all back. They're back in 1986 now. So while it's a happy and, somewhat joyous occasion, keep in mind that they are going to be struggling with all of this coming back and bubbling back up to the surface again. And so you better have some resources available, whether that's a victim advocate, whether that's yourself, whether you're going to be, there for them. You better have a plan in place, because it's going to happen.
Thanks for joining us. Your attention today brings us one step closer to exposing and eliminating the evil that brings crime to our communities. Hit subscribe and share this episode. Together, we will bring justice to every victim.